With me is Professor Danny Dorling from the University of Oxford. Welcome, Danny. Let's begin with how far the current generation of young people are worse than their parents.
They're worse in many ways. The main way in which their situation is worse is that the demand for them has lowered. The demand for them to do jobs, the demand for them to be seen as needed in society has reduced. And that simply wasn't the case for their older parents. People who were the same age as them, but in the late 1970s, or even the early 1980s, had it far better in terms of the chances of getting a job, and a good job, and a job they might actually stay in, and then being able to get a house, being able to bring up a family, all those things that we're used to. Those have been reduced in terms of how simple it is to do that by what's happened most recently. The other thing which is happening is the kind of age of majority is being pushed up to 25. You don't become a proper adult until you're 25. There's a special small, low minimum wage for people under 25. There are different rules in terms of housing benefit, so that if you're younger, it's assumed that you can share a house with strangers and you shouldn't be allowed to have your own home or your own flat. And this is making young adults into children again, and that should be resented, I think.
Where did it all come from? Where is it that Labour and the Tories all say under 25s, no job seekers allowance, no housing benefit?
One thing you're getting in general is a war on almost all easy targets, because there's a desperate attempt as the country gets poorer for people at the very top to keep hold of what they've got. That relies on a huge number of other people having to lose out. And there are many targets. The poor are one target, immigrants are another target, but the young are a target that you can say we can make some savings here. And you need to make a lot of savings in very many areas if you want the best of 1% to carry on having the kind of incomes and lifestyles that they've got accustomed to.
And you're saying that it wouldn't be acceptable if it was a sexist thing or a racist thing or an anti-disabled thing, this anti-young policy.
You couldn't have a minimum wage which was, say, lower for women than for men. Or if you're black, you could be paid less because you were not white. You couldn't, and there were suggestions of having a lower minimum wage for disabled people, and the Member of Parliament who suggested it was laughed out.
But of course there is a lower minimum wage for young people in this country.
There is a lower one for young people, and you're allowed to do this. You're partly allowed to do this because young people at least know they're going to stop being young at some point. So it's the kind of deal is, you know, we'll treat you badly now, but don't worry, when you're 25 or when you're 30, you'll get to be treated like a grown-up. But then they keep on changing the goalposts. There are new rules about what happens at age 30 for housing benefit. And of course they keep on pushing the retirement age up as well. So things are being taken away from young people and new impositions are being placed on them. Nothing new that is good is being given towards young people, despite the fact it's now the hardest time, probably that it's been since at least the 1880s, to get work as a young person in Britain today.
Since the 1880s?
Since the 1880s. If you look at unemployment in the 1930s, it was middle-aged men who couldn't get work. There was cheap work for young labourers in the 1930s. The mass unemployment was mainly a problem for people who were trying to bring in a wage to support a family. So you have to go back before the 1930s to see youth unemployment levels, real unemployment levels of the kind of scope that we've got today.
You found some disturbing correlations about one policy that the Condemned Coalition continually trumpets, the work programme.
Well, the work programme basically hasn't helped. The work programme forces people who've been on benefits for a number of weeks into various kinds of work experience, but then they go out of it again, and unemployment doesn't fall as the work programme comes in. And you're also getting new kinds of enforced labour where people are being forced to work just for their benefits, not for any wages. And this, of course, then reduces jobs for other people who would have done that work for a wage if their place hadn't been taken by somebody being forced to do it who was on benefits. And why, when I was young, didn't we have 1 million young people unemployed? Why was there work back then when there wasn't a work programme? There weren't these other things. And part of the reason is that back then we shared out our wages a bit more equally. So we weren't paying the top 10% so very much and the top 1% such incredible amounts of money. So there was more money in the wage bill, which meant you could employ younger people on low wages but actually in jobs. Now we have as much money still in the wage bill, but it's being shared out amongst a smaller and smaller group, and the cost of the top 10% and the top 1% is escalating, which is partly why firms are simply not taking on young people, because they don't have the money to take them on, because they're spending that money on a few older people's salaries.
Aside from signing on, of course, the other big benefit issue is housing benefit. How would Labour or Conservative, Liberal Democrat policy changes affect British society?
Well, the proposed changes are that housing benefit is taken away from under 25-year-olds. I'm old enough to remember when housing benefit was taken away by Margaret Thatcher from 16 and 17-year-olds. And I can remember it because that's the first time I saw 16 and 17-year-olds on the street in Britain. Before then, there were only a few people on the streets. They were almost all men, and they were in their 50s, 60s and 70s. And that was what homelessness was like before we took away those first benefits from the young. We've already seen street homelessness rising. If you take away housing benefit from people under 25, you're going to see more homeless than that.
So why do the policymakers, the think tanks, and the politicians seem to think it's a good idea?
They need to save money.
It's not just saving money. Some of them also say
Yes.
it would be good for society if people
looked
weren't reliant on housing benefit.
and looked after their own children, and you had these kind of happy nuclear families where you were reliant on the patriarch and it would all work out okay. I mean, it may be that some of their own families are actually like this, and they're looking after their own children into their 20s and through to their 30s. But it creates terrible tensions in families because you become reliant on the goodwill of your relatives. And if you don't get on with your relatives, if there's any problem of domestic abuse, if there's any problem of violence, you can't walk away from that anymore if you're reliant on them to house you. And we saw this in the 1970s and 1960s. This is why charities like Crisis and Shelter were started, because of that film Kathy Comes Home, with a young woman pushing her children through the streets with a pram. We've forgotten what it is we were trying to get away from, why we gave people benefits at these young ages in the first place, because of the situations they were in. And we're kind of trying to get back to an imagined past that never really existed, of happy families just looking after themselves and not relying on the wider society and state to make things work when things don't work within families.
How successful can they continue to be, the government or the political parties, and I suppose the media, in making young people blame each other? Because many the time you'll watch on television young people going, yeah, I am working, why should I be subsidising those people on unemployment benefit?
You can go a long way over making people blame each other. You can ratchet this up and up and up, but eventually you get to a point when people will realise that the vast majority of them are losing out by what's happening, that they're not able to settle down, that they're not able to do anything other than to rent a home, that they can't find a way to have children with their partner, because where are they going to live and how are they going to afford to do that without having to move from one rented property to another rented property? There'll become a point when people will look around them and realise that when they think they failed, they've actually done what is normal, and when their children are seen as failures, in fact their children are doing what's normal, and when their siblings and their friends are in this situation, it isn't because of them or their failings, it's because they're being asked to compete in a new system where you're increasingly likely not to do well, and the chances of doing well, the chances of securing that one job, staying in it, being financially safe, are getting smaller and smaller and smaller.
Professor Danny Dorling, thank you.
Thank you.